looking at this image, this is going to be my standard image. This is going to be the outside of the brain, so here's the thumb of the boxing glove here. And just thinking about labeling some of these parts as a quick review. If I had to say what's the name of this lobe up here? Anybody? Frontal. Okay, this is going to be your frontal lobe. The thumb of the boxing glove is temporal. Temporal. Okay. Way back here, it's going to be your occipital lobe. Okay. Here's your cerebellum. Dusting off the cobwebs. And we also have this really important sulcus that we talked about previously. And I'll just draw that here. Remember the name of the sulcus? Anybody? What is the name of this sulcus right here? Yeah, that's my central sulcus. Okay, and what we're going to draw in now are all the regions that influence movement, all the cortical regions that influence movement, plus the cerebellum. The other thing, this is kind of like a lateral view, if you can imagine, just looking at the side. But just as representation, I'm going to draw in this structure, and we know it's inside, right? But this is going to be, important somatosensory relay area, and that's going to be your thalamus. So just do one thalamus. Everybody with me? See where we are? So nothing but review so far. Okay, regions involved in movement. We know that there's going to be an important one here in the frontal lobe. This one and it's just in front of the central sulcus. Does anybody remember what we called that previously? Yeah, that's okay. A couple of things, a couple of names. As we talked at the pre-central gyrus. Okay, it's also, AKA, is also known as primary motor cortex. Okay, primary motor cortex, and we're going to learn a new way to represent this area today. Since it's the primary motor cortex, we're going to call it M1, or motor 1. Okay? Spicy hot or no, like hot, like technically hot. Technically hot. You need some water or something? Okay. Okay. All right, that's M1. So the other area that we talked about previously. Oh, I forgot to label this. What's the name of this lobe here? Parietal. Great. That's your parietal lobe. Located here behind the central sulcus. We had another region that we talked about previously, and that resides in the parietal lobe. Does anybody remember the name of that region? Perfect. This is your post central gyrus. Another name that we talked about, also known as primary somatosensory cortex, right? Okay, so nothing new quite yet, except now we're also going to refer to it as S1. So primary somatosensory cortex, you can abbreviate that as S1. Also new for today is going to be an area that's in front of or rostral to M1, okay, also located in the frontal lobe. I have another area that's involved in movement, and that's known as your premotor cortex. Premotor, PRE, motor cortex. And we're going to abbreviate that as PMC, premotor cortex. Okay, premotor cortex is located, new area for today, located rostral to M1, primary motor cortex. And it's involved in influencing movement. And the last area in the frontal lobe that we're going to talk about is also just rostral to M1, and it resides here. This area is known as your supplementary motor area. Supplementary motor area is your SMA. Okay. Both your SMA and your premotor cortex work together, and they're involved in what you think about before you actually move. So they're involved in putting information together to make sure it's okay to move. We'll talk about that a little bit as we go. Thinking about another area that we had talked about previously, or drawn previously, it's going to be, I'll represent it here as just a brown circle. And these are also going to be involved in movement. And this is going to represent something known as the basal ganglia. Does anybody know any disease processes that are associated with basal ganglia problems? You just left. Parkinson's, yeah. Parkinson's is going to be one of those. We're going to talk about two as semester goes through. We're going to talk about Parkinson's. For all those people who are just with Parkinson's exercise group, that's basal ganglia problem. Okay, the other disease process we're going to talk about is Huntington's disease. Okay, so we'll talk about those two. But in general, for right now, know that basal ganglia are involved in influencing movement. And in order for movement to happen, colors here, the basal ganglia has to, so here you're going to have some relay information from the basal ganglia is going to relay information about initiation and modulation of movement specifically to the premotor cortex and the supplementary motor area. And you should also know that the thalamus, the major somatosensory relay area, I don't know if I said it before, but if I haven't, the thalamus receives all sensory information except for olfaction. Okay, that's the only thing it doesn't receive. But so all this somatosensory information coming in from the thalamus is going to be relayed to the premotor cortex as well as the supplementary motor area. Modulation and movement, yeah, initiation and modulation, those are going to be two of the biggies. Okay, and you should also know that information coming from the cerebellum is also involved in influencing movement. So we talked previously about the dorsal and spinocerebellar tracts that were coming up to the cerebellum. And does anyone remember what kind of information they carry up to the cerebellum? Anybody? So that's going to be your non-conscious proprioception. So non-conscious proprioception information is coming up from the cerebellum to both your premotor cortex as well as your supplementary motor area.
What's non-conscious what?
Proprioception. Non-conscious proprioception. So you have information coming from the thalamus, all this amount of sensory information, or all sensory information coming in. You have information coming from basal ganglia. Basal ganglia are involved in initiation and modulation of movement, essentially, and you have information coming from the cerebellum. In other words, where all your joints are in three-dimensional space without you even being aware of it. You know, all that information is coming into the premotor cortex and the supplementary motor area, and the premotor cortex and the supplementary motor area make sense of that information, and then sends information over to M1. Gathers all this information, processes it, and sends information over to M1 region, where the upper motor neurons reside, and they're basically saying it's either safe to move or it's not safe to move. Okay. So an example, so both the supplementary motor and the premotor cortex. Give you an example of that. So if you're walking along and you're not really paying attention. Did you have a question, Paul?
Sorry, the premotor cortex also makes sure it's safe to move? Or?
Yeah, they both do. Yeah, so I have arrows here coming from the supplementary motor area and the premotor cortex, because both are receiving all that information. You can just consider them important in processing information. All this information that's coming in is being processed, and then they're coming over to M1 saying either move or don't move, fire or don't fire. And the example that I like to use to make sense of this is if you're walking, let's say you're walking on a trail, I don't know if you guys, and you're not really paying attention to the ground, you're just walking along, and did you ever, as you're walking, just step into a hole and you kind of go down? So you don't keep walking, right? You stop. That's an example. So all that sensory information's coming in, all the information from your cerebellum is coming in, your basal ganglia is saying, whoa, something's off, right? So that's where you don't keep moving. Your premotor cortex and your supplementary motor area said something's different. We're going to stop here for safety. Does that make sense to everybody? Yeah? Okay. So that's coming from all the frontal lobe. And then back here behind S1, I'm going to put in another important processing area where the premotor cortex and the supplementary motor area are important for processing information to send to motor. This area known as the posterior parietal cortex. In some cases you might see posterior parietal association area. It's the same word. Next year in neuro rehab we'll kind of use them interchangeably. Okay. This is known as your posterior parietal, because it's located in the parietal lobe cortex. And where SMA and PMC make sense of all the motor information coming in, process it, the posterior parietal cortex, or PPC, is responsible for processing more of the sensory information, or somatosensory information coming in. So, posterior parietal cortex. We know that all somatosensory information makes its way up to S1. We talked about the couple of somatosensory tracts. Johnny?
So the sensory information comes from there, but isn't sensory information also going to those premotor cortex and the supplementary motor cortex?
So the only difference is that the thalamus is receiving all sensory information. S1 receives all somatosensory information. So like auditory and vision are going to go through the thalamus, but they're not going to go to S1. So this is more of the this is more of total sensory information. Okay. I'll give an example about that one. So the posterior parietal cortex specifically receives information from S1. So information, all somatosensory information that comes up here into S1 is transferred over to the posterior parietal cortex to make sense of it. Okay. And once it's interpreted by the posterior parietal cortex, that information is again sent over back to the PMC and the SMA for processing, saying is it safe to move or not safe to move. In thinking about somatosensory information, just somatosensory information. Example, I like to cook. I like cast iron, unfortunately. It's got a hot handle, right? So if I'm in the kitchen cooking and I forget to grab my pot holder and I just grab that handle, it's going to be super hot, right? So in thinking about the job of the posterior parietal cortex, once I feel that heat, I'm going to pull away. I'm not going to continue to pick up the pan. Does that make sense to everybody? So that's information coming in. Chase?
So does that mean like people who can't feel pain have an issue with their somatosensory cortex and brain?
There is a process. There is a problem. I can't remember the name of it, but there is a problem where people can't feel pain. I don't know that they've really figured out why they can't feel pain. I know that's just an interesting area of research that's going on. Yeah, what's the name? Go ahead.
I don't remember the name, but I think it's actually mutations or changes in their peripheral nerves when the nociceptors don't fire the action potential. I think it's more peripheral than it is central.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I don't know the etiology, but I don't remember the name. It has a specific name. It was a research interest of mine years ago, but I don't remember. Any other questions about that? Yes. No.
So does it always go through that route? It goes from S1 to PPC to like interpret the information, then it goes to the motor, which is the PMC and the SMA, to then tell you if you can move and do that, and then it goes to the M1 to.
Yes.
What's the M1 again?
The primary motor cortex. That's precentral gyrus.
Oh, okay. Yeah,
M1.
And it interprets.
It interprets, yeah. So your M1, so if it's safe to move, then this is going to depolarize these motor neurons,
Okay.
the upper motor neurons that are in here. Okay, and that depolarization is going to happen specifically through this area.
Okay.
Okay, so that's pre-motor cortex stuff.
Okay.
Okay, does that make sense to everybody where we are? So we have an example where we had some information, some relative somatosensory information coming in, but then there's other somatosensory information that's relayed to S1, goes to the posterior parietal cortex, and then comes back and also influences movement. Okay, and then there's one more thing that's going to influence movement. Let's see if I can do a different color. Back here in the occipital lobe, what kind of information is processed in the occipital lobe? So just wrote it down. I'm going to cover it. What did I? Vision. Yeah, vision is processed here in the occipital lobe. Okay. You also have visual information coming in, and visual information is going to be processed here in your PPC, or your posterior parietal cortex. Okay. Specifically, that visual information coming directly in. It's coming directly in. Example of that is I like to run on trails, and if I'm running along a trail and I see this large black snake trying to cross the trail, I'm going to stop. I've seen danger, right? I'm not going to keep going, and that's going to be a visual processing stimuli. But you can see all of these different regions are going to influence movement or voluntary movement. Essentially, it's processed in the supplementary motor area, premotor cortex, all this somatosensory information of basal ganglia, information from the cerebellum, information about vision, all comes through, and essentially upper motor neurons in M1 will fire once they receive all that information if it's safe to move. Questions? Go ahead, and then, yeah.
Okay. So it goes straight to the PPC, or does it ever go through the S1, the vision?
Vision
Like
doesn't go
visual.
through S1. So remember,
it just skips S1.
S1 is the somatosensory cortex.
Oh, so
Remember
that's
that
not-
one?
yeah.
Yeah. So this is the one that's going to receive information from DCML and SVT.
Okay.
Vision has a whole different route that we're going to talk about later in the semester. Okay. So this is kind of a special guy coming through here. Vision does go through the thalamus too, but the thalamus is relaying all that information. So it's a redundant system.
Okay.
Okay. Just making sure that it's safe to move. Now, Sydney, your question?
So is this just voluntary movement or also like?
This is only voluntary movement. What other kind of movement are you thinking of?
Like
Involuntary?
Yeah,
Okay.
like the reflexive movement, like when you touch something a lot and you reflexively pull away.
Yeah, that's a little bit different. So there's going to be, this is voluntary movement, okay? And then that's going to be in response to pain, right? And then there's also going to be reflexes that you're going to talk about in pediatrics next year that are developmental reflexes that appear and disappear at different stages of development as you grow. Okay, you'll talk about that. And realize regular reflexes, like tendon reflexes that we're going to do today, are just a reflex arc. Only involve the tendon and the spinal cord, nothing at the level of the cortical region. Okay. Okay. Any other questions? Yep. Yes, Lisa.
So since the thalamus receives all of the information except for olfactory, so vision also goes to the thalamus.
Vision also goes to the thalamus, as does hearing. Yes.
So how does that play out? Just going to the rear first, right there.
Vision, so two separate structures. I'm trying to realize there's lots and lots of neurons, lots of axons, lots of connections. There's something called the human connectome project, where they've actually mapped out all the different connections in the brain. Okay? So I'm trying to make things super simple. What I'm trying to represent here is that the thalamus makes direct contact, makes a direct axonal connection with both the premotor cortex and supplementary motor area. Right? Directly. Okay? You also know that the thalamus connects with S1. That's where you're, yeah. The thalamus does connect with S1. But S1, everything that goes through S1 also goes to the posterior parietal cortex, as well as visual information comes into the posterior parietal cortex. And that itself is it's indirect and redundant. Yes, indirect and redundant system. Okay, that's movement. But you should know that all these things influence movement for your motor. Okay, any other questions? All right, let's move on and move on. All right. Going to descending motor tracks. Again, this drawing is going to be nothing more than a review. We did this on the spinal cord overview, and we're going to review it again today in big picture format. Then we're going to go through each of the motor tracks in detail, like we did with the somatosensory tracks. Then we're going to look at it again as a big picture view. Okay, so this is going to be my standard frontal section here. Okay, so this is the descending motor tracks. As far as descending motor tracks, we know that the corticospinal tract is going to decussate at some point. So I always like to just go ahead and put in my midline to start with. Okay, so this is nothing more than differentiating left from right. And let's say that this is this person's right side and this is their left side. So just a frontal section looking here at the, let's say, it's the cortex, right, in general. Here's your cerebellum. And uppermost portion of the brain stem is going to be your midbrain. Here's your pons, and here's your medulla, and your spinal cord. Okay. Just a brief overview. Hopefully that's a simple review for everybody, just labeling parts. Talked about the big tract that's responsible for voluntary movement. Again, this is movement under conscious control. here in the precentral gyrus, we're going to have a neuronal cell body. Okay. That neuronal cell body is going to be, we're going to call it an upper motor neuron cell body. Talk more about what that means. That's very specific, and that's something you need to know. We're going to go through it. Okay. The upper motor neuron sends out axons, and these axons descend through the midbrain, through the pons, and reach the level of the caudal medulla. The level of the caudal medulla, they then decussate to the opposite side. And then they're going to descend down the spinal cord in synapse with the lower motor neuron, the area of the ventral gray horn. We'll look at that today. So this upper motor neuron cell body sends out an axon, decussates at the level of the caudal medulla, descends, or 90% of these axons are going to decussate and travel down in something known as the lateral corticospinal tract, which we looked at in a cross-section of the spinal cord. At the appropriate level, they're going to synapse with the lower motor neuron cell body, and that lower motor neuron is going to be responsible for innervating skeletal muscles. Let's label that. So here's your, this guy is going to be your lower motor neuron, and it innervates skeletal muscles for voluntary movement. Okay, so a little bit of a review from when we did the spinal cord overview. Does anyone remember the name of what this tract would be called? We're going to see it all the way through as we go through. Does anybody, what's the name of this tract? Yeah, no, this is going to be your corticospinal tract. Remember, tract is going to be named for area of origin and area of termination. Area of origin is the cortex. Area of termination is the spinal cord. So this is the corticospinal tract. Okay. Corticospinal tract, or CST. That's going to be the tract involved in voluntary movement of skeletal muscles. You may also hear it called something else, and we'll learn why that is. But the other name for the corticospinal tract that you may hear is known as the pyramidal tract. So pyramidal tract. And we'll learn why some people call it that today. Okay, questions about corticospinal tract? Yes?
You said it was voluntary or?
Voluntary. This is all voluntary movement. So this upper motor neuron travels down, synapses with the lower motor neuron, and causes voluntary movement of the skeletal muscles. This is all voluntary. This is all under conscious control. You think about that if you think about the cortex being involved in thought. It starts out here in the cortex. Any other questions? Okay. As far as other descending tracts that we've talked about previously, there's another one that exists. These motor tracts, descending motor tracts. There's another one that exists here in the midbrain, and I'll represent it as this kind of maroon-colored circle. Okay. It starts in this thing known as the red nucleus. Red nucleus and sends out axons that decussate at the level of the midbrain. Okay, Okay, they travel to the opposite side immediately, right out of the red nucleus, and they travel on down through the pons and medulla and spinal cord, and they travel in this tract known as the rubro, R-U-B-R-O, spinal tract. Rubrospinal because it came from the red nucleus, rubro, down to the level of the spine. Okay. At the level, the appropriate spinal level, the rubrospinal tract then synapses with lower motor neuron here. And this lower motor neuron, does anybody remember what the rubrospinal tract influences? Upper extremity flexion, yeah, exactly. Upper extremity flexion, specifically elbow flexion in humans. Okay, so you can see from the picture that both the corticospinal tract and the rubrospinal tract decussate. Two motor tracts that decussate. Okay, we talked about these just a little bit before. We're going to move on down to the level of the pons, and in the pons there's another nucleus that we talked about previously, and I usually represent this as a little kite so that you can recognize it. It sort of looks like that too. This is known as the vestibular nucleus. Okay, the vestibular nucleus exists in pons, and it sends out axons that don't decussate. They just travel from the level of the pons straight through the medulla all the way down to their appropriate spinal level. Synapse with the lower motor neuron there that specifically innervates a certain kind of muscle group. Does anybody remember what vestibulo? This is the vestibulospinal tract. Vestibulospinal tract innervates what kind of muscles? Does anybody remember? Yeah, extensor muscles, postural extensor muscles. Good. Okay, postural extensor muscles. And you'll notice that both the red nucleus is not under conscious control, or the rubrospinal tract, nor is the vestibulospinal tract under conscious control, because they're originating out of the brain stem. Okay, I like to use the vestibulospinal tract often when working with patients with brain injury or somebody who can't really communicate with me. I know that if a person, even if a person's in a coma, if I get them upright against gravity, I'm going to cause that vestibulospinal tract to fire. The vestibular nucleus is involved in learning where your body is in three-dimensional space, or your head. Once I get those extensor muscles to fire, that person can maintain, those muscles are going to get stronger. Okay, so you can use things like that when you're working with patients in mental rehab. I like to use the vestibulospinal tract a lot. The last motor tract that we talked about, yes?
So you said all three of these that we have are conscious?
So all three are conscious? No. No, rubrospinal and vestibulospinal are not conscious because they're below the level of the cortex. Okay? The only one that's under conscious control is going to be your corticospinal tract that starts in the cortex. All the others are not under conscious control. So they're always firing. Okay, and their job is to influence muscle tone or muscle action at the level of the lower motor neuron. We'll see that later. Okay, the last one that we talked about a group of diffuse nuclei, and I'll represent it here in this pink color, that exists in the medulla. Okay, these nuclei are involved in awakeness or awareness or consciousness, and these are going to be, does anybody remember the name of the diffuse nuclei? Say? Yeah, reticular formation. Good. This is your reticular formation. Okay, your reticular formation. And if you remember, the reticular formation sends out axons also that descend in the spinal cord. And these axons travel through something known as the reticulospinal tract. Okay, and your reticulospinal tract, synapses with lower motor neuron. And reticulospinal, again, is going to hit extensor muscles, so postural extensor muscles. You can think if you're awake and aware, you're upright against gravity, your postural extensor should fire. We actually did this when we did the spinal cord overview. This is just a quick review so that everybody's on the same page and it's fresh in your mind. Now what we're going to do is we're going to take each of these. We're going to look at the cortical. Paul, do you have a question?
Which ones were under conscious control again?
The only one under conscious control is the one that starts in the cortical region. So that's going to be your corticospinal tract. See that? Because all the others are starting below the level of the cortex, which is your Johnny?
You said that the reticulospinal tract and the vestibulospinal tract are the extensor postural muscles?
Yes. Mm-hmm. Yeah, postural extensor muscles.
So not all of them are under voluntary control?
Only one is. Only one is under voluntary control. The others are always working. They're automatic. Okay, you'll learn. So there's if a person doesn't have any cortical region firing at all, they present with something that's known as a decorticate posture. Decorticate posture looks like this. What do you think is causing that? It's automatic. I'm not thinking about it. If I have decorticate posture, what's causing this presentation? Anybody see it? What's causing that elbow flexion? Cerebrospinal tract. You see it, right? Okay. So, for example, if this is influencing my movement and I don't have any of this coming down, I'm going to get upper extremity flexion. Okay, that's called a decorticate posture. Sometimes you see it with patients with brain injury, okay, that are in a coma. That's decorticate posturing. You know that the problem is above the level of the red nucleus because they're presenting with sweat. Okay. Now, there's also something known as decerebrate posturing. Okay. It happens below the level of the red nucleus. So what is still firing here? What would I expect my elbows to do in this posture? Extend. That's just that simple. Okay. So decerebrate posture has extended elbows, actually wrist flexion for whatever reason, but extended elbows, and that's the reason why there's a difference. So decorticate is here, above the level of the red nucleus. Decerebrate is here, below the level of the red nucleus. The only difference is the elbow presentation, because I don't have any upper motor neuron influence from the corticospinal tract. Yes.
So the reticulospinal tract and the vestibulospinal tract both influence the postural extensor muscles.
Extensors, yeah.
Okay. What are the differences?
What are the differences between the two? Okay, good question. So the vestibulospinal tract, start with that one. Okay, that's specifically coming from the vestibular nucleus. Okay, so information is being fed into the vestibular nucleus bilaterally from your vestibular system bilaterally, and we'll cover that later in the semester. Okay, so it's coming out of the vestibular nucleus, mostly where your head is three-dimensional space against gravity. Okay, reticulospinal tract, information is coming from, are you awake and aware or not? Okay, so if you're asleep, not so much. You get up, you're up. It's coming from here. If the reticulospinal tract is on, you want if you're awake and aware and walking around, you want that long as she's walking. That's the other story.
So, and they start like, particular points start
Correct. Ponds, yes, constant, yes. We'll talk about all this later. I'm just talking about the basic tracks. Did you have something you wanted to add, Dr. Blair? Or
I was gonna say, is the tourniquet posture, is that what you see with like brain injury, with a concussion also, like a severe?
Yeah, sometimes you see it in football games, right?
They'll do that.
Yeah, they'll do that. That's exactly right. You guys have seen that in football. So you get a big hit in the head, and that's more than just a concussion if you go to tourniquet. So the tourniquet is not non-responsive ordinarily. It's a serious brain injury. There's no cortical inflammation firing. Does that make sense? And it seemed like there was some confusion, so I tried to add another example. And this is something we'll talk more about next year in our rehab as well. Other questions? Okay, let's go through and look at the path of the corticospinal tract. Remember, that's going to be the big one. That's going to be here, starting with the cortical region. Looking at the corticospinal tract, again, this is something that I had previously when we looked at the somatosensory tracts. I had something that was similar, and this is nothing more than a frontal section right through the cortex. Okay, so if I label that, this is going to be my cortex. Okay, here's my longitudinal fissure. Oh, there's a throwback from way back when, right? What, 2 weeks ago? Fissure. Okay, there's my longitudinal fissure. Okay. In thinking about, I think I did this previously in this color, but I'm not really sure. What would these things be here? What am I coloring? What am I shading in here? Oh, right, great. These are my lateral ventricles. Here's my foramen Monro. Here's my third ventricle right here, and here's my cerebral aqueduct. Okay, we labeled these before, and I'll say and cerebral aqueduct, as I said, is a great landmark for the midbrain. So this is my midbrain. Okay? And other things that we labeled previously here, these are going to be, I used brown earlier, so I'm just going to keep the color the same. Okay, these are all basal ganglia. They're part of the basal ganglia system. We'll cover those later. Okay, so brown is going to be, these are my basal ganglia. Okay, and here my peace sign is going to be my thalamus. Okay, everybody see where we are? We did something similar with the somatosensory system previously. And then the one other thing I'll label is going to be this area here. Anybody remember what this area is that's between the basal ganglia and the ventricles? Whoa, internal capsule. Excellent. Okay, this is going to be my internal capsule. Internal capsule. Great. I think that's all of our players. Now let's start with the precentral gyrus. Up here in the precentral gyrus, I'm going to have an upper motor neuron cell body. I'll abbreviate upper motor neuron as UMN. There's my neuronal cell body. Okay, that upper motor neuron cell body is going to send out an axon. That now you're going to see how it travels. It actually goes straight on down the cortical region and cuts through the area of the internal capsule, just like the somatosensory information did. And it's going to travel straight down ipsilaterally through the midbrain. And that's going to be the start. And again, this is called the corticospinal tract. nothing new, nothing seriously new anyway. Kind of what we'd expect so far. Moving on, let's go ahead and look at the next would be the CST is cortical spinal tract, the decussation in the medulla. Okay, I will label. Let's see. Again, here's my cerebral aqueduct, and there's my third cranial nerve. So these are really good landmarks for this is the midbrain. Region below the midbrain and the brainstem is going to be your pons. And then lower down here, this is known as your medulla. And again, since we're going to be looking at something that's crossing over, I like to go ahead and put my midline in. These dots just represent left from right. This is going to be the right side, and this is going to be the left side, person's body. Okay, so far, should look pretty familiar. There's one change that I made here at the level of the medulla. I've added a little bit of definition. Okay, what you see, what I'm trying to show is it's bilateral. So this side has two bumps. So if you think about my fingers, my second and third fingers, this would be the first bump that's most medial, and then the second bump would be out here. And on this side, there's two bumps. There's a bump here in the middle and another bump. So essentially, there's just two bumps that exist in the area of the medulla. Okay. These two bumps, bilateral, have special names. The outermost bump here, this first bump, is known as the olive. Yes, it's an olive. Okay, the guy that taught me. Yes.
So 2 bumps per side, or
2 bumps per side. Yeah, I'm trying to show you that. So there's 2 bumps here. There's a bump here, bump, bump, and there's a bump here, bump. The outermost bump bilaterally.
They're both called olive?
So there's an olive here on the outside, and then there's an olive here on this outside. Okay, they're both bilaterally. They're olives. Okay. Is there a question about that? Does that make sense, everybody? I hear some. Okay, so the olive is the bump on the outside, the most lateral bump. The more medial bump has a special name. Ooh, this is the pyramid. Did you get it?
No, I took it.
Okay, it's the pyramid. It's the pyramidal tract. Okay, that's the pyramid. That medialmost bump is known as the pyramid. Okay. Does everybody see where I am? So outermost bump, olive, innermost bump, pyramid. It's a bump for a reason. We're going to talk about that. Okay. Now, following the track, so all we did is here's the what we just did is we're coming down here. We're following this neuronal axon here, promoter neuron axon. We're coming down. We're just coming through the midbrain, and we're going to go down. So we're coming from above, and I'm going to go down through the midbrain, through the pons, and then halt here at the level of the caudal medulla, specifically in the area of the pyramid. In the pyramid, we're going to have the majority of the fibers cross over to the other side in the pyramid. Okay, so it's called a pyramidal decussation. Let's go ahead and say this is called a pyramidal decussation. Okay, so it actually turns out that 90% of the fibers coming from above are going to decussate in the area of the caudal medulla. Just 90, the majority, right? 90%. It's almost all of them. It's a pretty good percentage. If you got 90% on a test, you'd be happy, right? So the majority of them. Okay. Now, the majority of these fibers come down and they travel This 90% continues to travel on down through the spinal cord, okay, and they travel in the spinal cord in that space that we labeled previously called the lateral corticospinal tract. Okay, that's your lateral corticospinal tract. So what happens to the other 10%? They don't want to decusate, and they just go straight on down, and they travel in a different tract. The tract that they travel in, this other 10%, I'm going to represent it here as these dots. So other 10%, they travel in something known as the anterior corticospinal tract. We'll look at that as we go through. Question?
Earlier you said we're gonna list some that doesn't decusate. I understand this one doesn't.
That's
Are
it.
we listing that, just this one?
This is the 10% of the corticospinal tract that does not decusate. Okay, 90% decusates and travels down the spinal cord in that area known as the lateral corticospinal tract. We'll look at that again in a minute. The other 10% doesn't decusate; it just goes straight on down. Okay, and it will decusate eventually, but it hasn't decussated yet. Questions? All right, it's a good spot to stop and take a 10-minute break.